Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley. And our guests this week are Roxanne Manning and Sarah Peyton. They are the authors of The Antiracist Heart, what's the subtitle? I got to get the subtitle in here. My screen is too small. A Self-Compassion Activism Handbook. Ladies, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, I guess we should start off with how you got together and why you wrote this book together.
Well,
you should be in unison. You should be so used to doing this. We know who goes first.
I love it when Sarah answers this one.
Okay.
Well, I ran into the whole anti-racism stuff as people started to tell me that I was being a white supremacist. And I was like, oh my God, me, a white supremacist.
You didn't even know.
I didn't even know. Of course, I didn't know. I have a friend who was talking about somebody who was doing all kinds of unknowingly doing racist stuff. And she said, how can she not have learned? She's 70 years old. And then she said, oh, she's had 70 years of being white. So here we are. Mm-hmm. I'm going, oh my God, how do I bring compassion to myself so that I can get myself out of this hole of shame that I'm in and actually keep being an activist and continue to participate in this conversation, which is so important. And so I worked on it for a little while, and then I called up Roxy. I said, Roxy, we need a book. And Roxy said, we need that book. I agree. But I need a book about my work. And I agreed completely because Roxy's work is beautiful. So I said, well, let's try I had a couple books that were published. I said, let's see if a publisher will take us both and do your book first and then do our book and see if we can sell it that way. So Roxy, you want to say anything about this story?
Yeah,
Roxy?
I would say that, for me, this was actually part of being anti-racist, because I was like, if I write a book with Sarah, everyone's going to say this is Sarah's book. She's a white woman. And if that was the only book we wrote, it would immediately become Sarah's work. And so I said, I have to do my own work. I need to be able for people to see me and see what I'm contributing. And then they'll be able to read the joint book and put it into context. And I didn't know at the time what it would mean to write two books in, 2 years. Like, that was crazy, but we got it done.
So why anti-racism? Let's start there. So you got to talk about the Antiracist Heart. People need to understand what anti-racism is and why it's so important.
Yeah. Well, for me, as a Black woman, it was something I've been working with all my life, right? I've had to learn how to first even recognize that racism was something that was impacting my life, and then to think about, and how do I want to respond to it? And that was part of the challenge I was seeing as I was looking at all the different ways people responded to it. There was a lot, we just went through the whole pandemic. We went through a lot of the kind of calling out, shaming, blaming, canceling people. And that didn't match how I move through the world. It didn't match what I believe nonviolent communication contributes to creating a new way of being together. So I wanted to find a way to really, it sounds trite, but create a world where everybody can thrive, where everybody knew that they were valued, regardless of their race. And that's what anti-racism is for me, that it's about creating a world where we can all show up and be valued.
Will?
Yeah, I have a lot of questions about this. First of all, thanks to you guys for coming on the show. I guess this is kind of more a center-right program overall. So we've had a lot of business people and generals and so on. We've tried to extend, Charles has tried to extend offers to people across the aisle. And I don't know, Charles, the response rate's been less than 50%.
Yeah, unfortunately, they think that, they should listen to us. We don't really attack people, but they think that everything has to be some partisan conversation. So yeah, I think the conversations are better. How do you have the conversations if you only have conversations with, these small silos? So I think they're important.
Yeah. So, I'm not a hostile interviewer at all, if only because we do this show at 9 o'clock at night after I'm already done, meetings and all that for the day. But I mean, I guess one of the questions that comes up a lot, I mean, there are many, I was a business executive for a while, and there are many programs that focus on teaching anti-racism, diversity, equity, inclusion, various other what someone might jokingly call alphabet soup concepts, ESL or ESG, SEL, so on down the line. When you talk about anti-racism, what would you practically define that as being? What do you want to teach people to be able to do? Just interact with one another, totally absent biases, or what would the end game goal there be?
So the end game goal for me is that it's two goals. There's a short-term goal and a long-term goal. The short-term goal is that we do something. We teach people how to relate to each other in ways that overcome the inequities that already exist. Like it's kind of acknowledging that there are still a lot of systemic inequities, a lot of biases that impact people, and we want to teach people how to recognize when that's happening and to respond to each other, respond to the situation in a way that mitigates that. And then the long-term goal, like, the kind of beloved community, what I want for my children's generation, is that this doesn't matter. That when somebody says, what's anti-racism? Somebody be like, well, what's racism? That it makes no difference. And that's my long-term goal, but we're not there yet.
Right, that's true. Can I ask a question about that, Will? And I'll go back to you.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Because this is weird, because I talk a lot about words being important to me. I'm kind of a literal guy, sometimes to a fault. And a lot of what people are hearing, so I think a lot of people glopped onto a lot of this stuff at the beginning because it sounded good. And I haven't disagreed with anything that you said. But what my only concern is, in practice, is everybody practicing it the way you did? Because your book is set up, it's like for those who don't know, you should pick it up. It's a handbook. It's got questions and it's got parts where you work in. It's like a self-help book. It's telling you, it gives you exercises, right? And Roxanne just said that her long-term goal was for everybody to get along, right? And the short-term goal was understanding that these differences and biases exist, but teaching people how to relate to one another. What I find in practice sometimes is a lot more aggressive than that, right? And outside of that, I also think, just because I have a young kid in school, so I see it in schools, and I'm on the school board. And what I find that they do here in New York is, it's weird. So I get that the melting pot concept was good. It got a little old. People thought it wasn't working the way it should have been. That's fine. But what I see them doing now is they focus so much on the differences, but they're doing it with the positive intent. I assume positive intent. So I don't think it's some Marxist, evil plan. I think they think, in order to make people better, that we need to understand the differences. But what they do is they have a finite amount of time in school. They spend so much time focusing on the differences and they don't get to anything else. So all the kids end up learning is the differences. They don't get the second part, but oh, by the way, we're doing this so you understand that in spite of these differences, you can still get along. So it, to me, seems like it just ends up causing even more friction, because there's so much focus on gender, race, religion, and all the differences, and they're doing it to young kids, so they're not really at the point that they understand the nuances. So do you see any of that, and how do we overcome it, if you've noticed that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of what makes our approach really different in some ways. Our approach is really grounded in nonviolent communication. And for your listeners who don't know what that's about, one of the big premises is that we're all humans, which sounds super trite. We're all humans. We all have the same needs.
Right.
And we all behave and move through the world because we're trying to attend to our needs. And that's the key concept there. And so because that's the foundation of how I'm trying to relate to people, that's where we start. That's why I'm having people start. Like, whenever there's a difference, it's also looking at, like, well, you're behaving in a way that I don't understand. What's the need you're trying to meet? Not focusing so much only on the difference, but trying to get to the heart of what makes us similar. What are the things that, if we can understand, this is a need you have that I also have, how can we find a way to work together? And I
Sarah,
think that part is huge.
And what do you think about that? Because I also find that another important thing Roxy said was that, excuse me, that she was kind of alarmed by people being canceled. And in the book, you talk about, you need to talk to everybody, even whether whiteness is an issue and somebody has these white supremacist beliefs, that you can't just ignore them like they're not human anymore. And I think the society now is basically saying, if you say the wrong thing, you're persona non grata.
Well, there's a complexity here, because one of the things that Roxy always talks about is what are the costs of speaking up?
Mhm.
So there's not in neither in Roxy's book, How to Have Anti-Racist Conversations, nor in our joint book, The Antiracist Heart,
Mhm.
do we ever say you have to talk to everybody. We say, what do you want to do? Like, what is the grounded place within you? Do you want to reach out to this person? Is it really important to you? And if you do want to reach out, then seeing their humanity is going to help a little bit, rather than seeing them as a person with horns, So it's quite a complex place to enter.
Right.
And that's why I thought self-compassion was so important, because it settles the nervous system and allows us to tap into, if we have an intention for beloved community, if we have an intention to extend ourselves and to make sure that everybody, can have a place with us, even if we do not agree with them at all, which is something that I really admire about your work, Charles, is like, everybody's, come on, bring it on, bring your voice,
Right. Well,
Can I add something there?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, because for me, like, this piece always comes up. People are like, why am I going to have to talk to somebody who's trying to kill me, right? And I want to be super clear. That is not our message. Part of our goal, though, is like, if somebody's trying to harm you, you get to say, like, well, nope, I'm not engaging there. I don't have the energy. I don't have the bandwidth. But
Right.
what we are wanting is, if I just cancel that person, change doesn't happen. So I want to be part of a community where it's like, I don't have the resources to do this. Somebody else will. If there's a white supremacist who's saying all of these hateful things, this is when all the people who want to be white allies can step up and be like, we're going to have that conversation with that person in a way that's calling them in, not canceling them so they go away and then kind of double down on the hateful beliefs. So it's really around, how can we hold everybody without it being too much cost to any single person?
Well, I saw Will respond, and because we've been doing this show together a lot, I'm going to assume that he kind of reacted to what you said. I'm going to assume, and see how well I know him, that it was because you used an example of, you don't have to talk to the person that had to kill you. What do you say to the person trying to kill you? Will would probably say, well, you should probably tell them that they're probably not trying to kill you.
Well, I think there are two things. Like, if someone were actually trying to kill me, my reaction would be to kill them. But in terms of, I do think that kind of, I mean, bluntly, that does lead into one of the questions that I think a lot of people would have about this, or about anti-racist training and teaching in general, praxis, etc. Which is, when you say, like, this would work, perhaps even if we're talking about a white supremacist, the response would be, how common is that? As you guys know, one of the major critiques against anti-racist or DEI training is that it teaches people to focus on kind of the minor inconveniences of life, perhaps too much. And I do have one empirical example here that I'm going to ask a question as opposed to just like windbagging along. But I mean, so in the USA right now, I've read most of the recent list experiments that are aimed at detecting subconscious bias. And about 5 to 10% of both whites and African Americans, in terms of questions like, would you reject an interracial love relationship, seem to be classic old school bigots. It's not, I haven't seen one recently that's above that bar. So a lot of the stuff focused on microaggressions or individual conflict seems to be, among people that aren't necessarily racist, just what used to be thought of as kind of the reality of life. I teach at a historically black college, so white kids will complain about the same sort of things in a minority position that black kids complain about in a minority position. And then they'll just get up and go play basketball with their roommate. So to some extent, so this is the empirical example. I actually every year ask both my white and black students in a class called quantitative methodology how many negative experiences they would say they have in a typical like 1 week period. So that could be, a shove on the ball court, a glare in the store, a road rage in traffic. And then secondarily, how many of them they think are attributable to racial prejudice. It's as you guys know, it's an old social science question. And though last year, the white kids said 14 and the black kids said 14 and a half. But the black kids attributed half of the negative experiences to racial prejudice. Now, I mean, I have no doubt that the 0.5 or the 1 was quite possibly due to bias. But what I guess two questions. One, what would you define the racism that you're training people to be anti as being? And two, secondarily, how would you respond to that claim that you're teaching people to focus on just what everyone experiences in life? Women, for example, encounter slightly more sexism than Black or Asian men do, racism, so on. What's the reply there?
And I hope you're reading something, Roxy, because otherwise you look like a ghost with that light you turned on.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to pull up some
Oh,
statistics,
okay.
but
I was like, I'm hoping
I'm
that's
not,
why you did
I'm
that.
not going to do it. I'm
No,
not
go
going to
ahead.
do
No,
it.
no, you can
Yeah.
go ahead. I
No, you
just,
can.
you
No.
can turn it
I
off
want to
when you're
like
done.
actually respond because this is a really interesting thing. Um,
Do
so
what you got to do,
first,
though. Just, go ahead. No, pull it up if you want. Just turn it off
it'll
when
take
you're
me a,
done. No,
okay,
pull it
it'll
up.
take me a second.
Okay, pull it up. Uh-huh.
Let me first respond just off the cuff to some of what I'm hearing.
Okay.
Um, the first piece is that what we're trying to help people address, like even though you're saying that your students are saying like, maybe the rates are about the same when they're asked to self-report, we do know that people are experiencing, like when we ask people about examples of microaggressions, and microaggressions are one of those things you're saying are like the minutia, the things that are not important, but those minutia are actually having an impact on people's well-being. That there's been a fair amount of research that shows that people who experience or who self-report experiencing a lot of microaggressions have like worse blood pressure rates, they have more stress, more depression, a whole bunch of other issues. And when I go into organizations and I'm like teaching people about this stuff, it's about both the minutia and also about the big things. Like I have people tell me about things that are not just, I was somebody. Oh, what's an example? Oh, did somebody didn't include me when they were acknowledging someone in a slide, and I was the only Black person not included, the only person of color not included. But I also have people tell me about things like, people are still like making comments about like my food smells or comments about my hair and things like this at work, and things that are letting me believe that I don't belong. And and then even worse are people saying things like, the classic stuff, like I'm trying to talk about something, and whenever I say it, it's completely ignored. If a white person talks about it, it gets acknowledged, it gets lifted up, it gets acted upon. I just recently talked to somebody who's in a pretty, like she's a executive at a major company, and I'm trying not to like disclose too much, and she has some brilliant ideas that are going to help address climate change. And what she says is like every time she brings this up to some of the senior management in her organization, it goes nowhere. And every so often, there'll be a white person who brings up one of these ideas and it gets picked up. And so this is also part of what I'm wanting to help people learn how to address. Both how do I feel comfortable moving through my workplace with some of these minutiae, because that's the stuff that impacts my blood pressure, impacts my sense of belonging in the workplace, but also how do I address some of the big stuff, the things that we would say are like kind of classic racism.
Right. Wow. I got a question about that.
Mhm.
And this goes to the book. You couldn't think of an example. I can give you an example because I read the book and it's an example in the book.
Mhm.
So I'm torn because I agree with you that these microaggressions can have those effects, and it can have an emotional and mental state and wear you down and all that kind of stuff. 100% true. But a lot of that is because is your a situation in your own making, in the sense that is how you deal with that. Just like people who dealt with overt racism, it was how they dealt with it. And what I mean by that is sometimes the microaggression is in your head. So the action actually happened. That was Will's point. So they both said that they got, little things that happened. And then they attribute it to race. The problem is because you attribute it to race doesn't mean it's race. So one of the examples in the book was you're talking, this is one of Roxy's examples thing. You're at a restaurant with your white friend, and I believe her mother. You're talking to you're talking to your friend, like, hey, Lisa, how are you doing? You're having a conversation. And the hostess walks up and sees the three of you, Black women, two white women, turn to the white woman and says, two?
Yeah.
Right. See, or examples like that. Or there was one about parking. When I go to the Silicon Valley Walgreens, there's plenty of parking all over close to the door. When I go to Oakland, the parking spaces up front are reserved for police because of some kind of stereotype against whites, and I think all this. So some of these things are assumptions of race. So it's not even really a microaggression. If somebody say, I want to touch your hair, that's clearly a Black thing. But if somebody just says, says something rude to you, and you just say, one of my favorites is Dennis Prager. used to tell the story about him when he was 8 years old. He was in the backseat of his grandfather's car. He's Jewish, grandfather obviously Jewish, and they'd be driving, and he thought it was funny. He didn't understand, and so somebody would cut him off in traffic, be at night, and his grandfather would just go anti-Semite, right? And he would just like, he was like 8. He would laugh. Oh, that's grandpa. He was like, grandpa, he didn't even see you. How does he know you're Jewish, right? So sometimes the microaggression will have that physical effect on you, but you have no way of knowing that it's due to racism. You're believing that it's racism. So I'm not discounting your belief, but it doesn't make it fact, right? So we're trying to fix something that may not be racism. So how do we know that the microaggression is even there? Sarah, raise her hand so Sarah wants to go.
Yeah.
I'm going to call on people. Sarah.
This is why the book is about self-compassion, because we live in a world that's complicated and where lots of stuff goes right and lots of stuff goes wrong. And the more that our nervous system gets to be fully acknowledged, like for the old guy driving in the car at night, like, would he like a little acknowledgement that he lives in a world that's got the Holocaust in it, for God's sake?
Right.
You know, would he like a little bit of acknowledgement that indeed he has been living for 70 years in a dangerous world?
Right.
Once we start to have those conversations, people's reactivity decreases, and then they can become even more clear about how to move forward with connecting, with making requests, with communicating in order to decrease all of this stuff.
Okay, one follow-up to you, then I'm gonna go back to Will, then I'm gonna ask some specifics about the book. So I like that, but my only thing is, if that's the case and it's complicated, and we know we are emotional beings that react to all these things, we have a mental stress level and all that kind of things, is it best to be focusing on the negative? It seems like a lot of what I hear, you have to be honest about the realities of life, no question. But no one's trying to focus on the positive. No one's saying, I mean, it's like, to get to the positive, we got to trek through all this mud first, right? As opposed to talking about, yes, these things happen, but we all, like Roxy said, we all want the same things. We have these desires, there's some general, human need that we all have, right? But instead of that, it seems like it's just this constant talk about the negativity, right? He has to be, we need to acknowledge with this man in your example that he lives in a world where the Holocaust happened, and he has to deal with this stuff that that exists, and that's true. But there are other very positive things that you could be talking about, and other things that have happened in his life that we don't seem to focus on. So aren't we indirectly causing them to focus more on the negative?
It feels like a straw man in a way, because there's nothing in what we're saying that says people are not focusing on the positive things and celebrating.
Oh, no,
all
you're
of
not
the
saying that.
wonderful...
I'm saying I don't see it, is what I'm saying. So maybe they are, and I just don't see it.
Yeah,
I'm not
I think
saying
people
you're saying
do.
that we shouldn't do. Okay.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are.
Okay.
And the other thing, though, is that just like that man in the car, it's like, yes, maybe he can't tell that somebody's looking at him and nobody can see him and he's still saying anti-Semite. But what he's actually saying in that moment is, I have been impacted by the Holocaust. I've been impacted by the experiences where it was very clear. And this is his nervous system kind of acknowledging, like, I still have this kind of underlying trauma because of this.
Okay.
And not paying attention to it doesn't heal it, doesn't make it better.
Right. Will.
Yeah, I mean, I think that last point is pretty important. I mean, in a large, diverse society, I actually agree with that people have a lot of perceptions that frankly may or may not be real, but that one tries to be polite about. I mean, this is my take toward all the various sky god religions. So, yeah, that's a valid comment. The one question, though, I'll try to actually ask a practical question. I'm kind of rambling a little bit.
Hey, what's wrong with you
stuff today? All right. Anyway, but so I'm going to ask a practical question again at the end of a comment. Looking at this again, I think that there's some data that all of us could pull up that's pretty relevant to this in terms of how people communicate. And something that I notice a lot in the American upper middle class, and this goes well beyond race, is kind of a constant lambent fear, where there are a lot of very educated people that are talking about a lot of tough topics, including this one, and people just get very nervous all of the time. So, I mean, for example, your perception that you're not you guys, but a person's perception that they face racial and sexual microaggressions increases. One of you guys might correct me. It's something like 300% if they go to college. So behaviors that people would have, and this is absolutely true. Behaviors that people would have thought of as just normal, like, hey, bro, can I rub your head for luck? Are seen as perhaps raced, classed, sexed, that kind of thing. And you would imagine that when you talk about some of those things like blood pressure, like if you report a lot of microaggressions, that correlates with higher blood pressure. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but something that strikes me was just that being afraid all the time or angry all the time, which is how I'd react to this, would correlate with higher blood pressure, whether people were abusing you or not. So, I mean, to me, coming from like a working class background, it seems, I still say it seems like a lot of this stuff could be handled in just the way it is outside of the academy. Like if someone did something to me that I thought was a bit racist, I'd say, hey, bro, that's kind of racist. Don't do that. Right. What's up? And that would be it. It wouldn't happen again if we liked each other. And like an Italian American buddy could say that to me. So from that perspective, I guess, as a question for both of you guys, what would your advice be if someone encounters a normal situation that they view as racist? Someone says, hey, could you not make that fish dish? It smells bad. Or, hey, brother, white girl, whatever, can I touch your hair? Maybe a little more sensitive on the intro there. What would you advise people to do? Does it depend on their mood, or are there set responses?
There are a couple of things I want to say. Like I got the question, but I want to go back a little bit first. If I remember, some of the stats was that regardless of people's level of class and income and education, people who reported experiencing more microaggressions also had all of these other negative sequelae. So it didn't matter about maybe this 300%, I want to kind of find that. That's actually kind of cool. But it was still people, working class people who were poor were still reporting that they were impacted by the experience of microaggressions. So I just wanted to name that. And then what do I do if somebody does or says something racist? For me, it's not about am I super educated or am I not educated? It's all the same thing. Because honestly, if you're experiencing racism, one of the things I always invite people to do is think, is this a time for me to speak up? Is it safe for me to speak up? Because if I'm the cashier at my local supermarket and my manager is being a jerk, I might not want to speak up because I want to keep my job. And so it's not so simple to say there's one set response. It's always thinking about, what will this do for me? How will this support me if I speak up in this moment? And then when I do want to speak up, then there are some things we can do that will help us speak up more effectively. And for me, I think y'all will actually agree with this, that one of the things I want to do is to actually say, what am I observing? Instead of just saying hey, that was racist, which we can get into a nice big argument about whether or not that was racist. I could be when you talk about my food being smelly or you ask to touch my hair, that's problematic for me. So I'm letting you know exactly what the thing is that you're doing rather than just naming it as racist.
Right. Whether it's racist or not, it's a problem.
Exactly. Exactly.
I think most intelligent people in the free range world come to pretty similar solutions in my experience. Yeah. I mean, if someone rubs my head and they happen to be a big Caucasian guy and I view it as a bit patronizing, I'll say, dude, don't rub my head. I mean, or, hey, that's, I don't know if I'd say problematic, but hey, that's a little lame. That's a little irritating. I mean, I think that is the response that 99% of human beings would use. Yeah. Which leads me into a second. When you talk about racism.
Before you do your next question, I want to challenge that 99% of people would just have a, hey, don't do that reaction. Because part of what we're working with the book is to get people to a point where they feel yeah, I can say that. I can actually say, stop. No, don't like this. And it's not 99%. I teach classes with hundreds of people in them, and they're all like, how do I get to a point where I can say that does not work for me? So we may live in very different worlds, but
I mean, so the group I'm thinking of,
there's not 99% of them going, that doesn't work for me.
Yeah, that's actually, no, that's an interesting point. I mean, the group I'm thinking of would probably be working class men of all races and then guys on, say, trading floors. And the response there would be from both groups would be don't be an asshole, bro.
Right,
some people might say homes. I mean, it wouldn't be, the response rate would be something like what I said, but you're right. I'd be interested in the demographics of the people actually that are working with you guys, well beyond race.
I want to speak to that because you just made me think of somebody who, like this really lovely man who came to a retreat, and he actually came back like 3 or 4 years. I do this retreat every year,
Sure.
and this was a black man. Think he didn't have a high school degree, had been in jail for murder, and served a pretty long sentence. Came out, and part of his work now is like bringing food and resources and material to some of the reservations. And what
Oh,
he
that's cool.
wanted to learn was, how can I actually talk to all these white people who, say they want to help me and do it in ways that are kind of toxic? And so I think this is actually the kind of person you're talking about, right? Somebody who's not like super educated, who had a pretty hard life, and who still was kind of thinking, I can't speak up about this because if I do, I'm going to be the person who ends up in jail. So I need to find a way to be able to talk about this in a way that's not going to get me into more trouble. So I don't know. I'm still pushing back a little bit on the idea that, a lot of people I know how to talk about these kinds of things.
I think he might be a specific case if he's on probation for murder. Like, I don't mean to make
He's not any. No, he's not anymore. Like he came to us after that was all
Stop
done, but
murdering.
he had still
No,
been, huh?
nothing. Nothing. I'm sorry.
no,
Yeah,
we're just making jokes.
I'm
But
just kidding.
yeah.
no,
I Most
Oh,
of my family is working class. Most of my family didn't go to college. And I would say that a lot of my family, they can talk trash about people, like when people do really crappy racist stuff, but they don't confront them. They very rarely confront them. And that feels pretty typical of the people I know in my circles.
Mhm.
yeah, it might be. I don't know where
Different
they're
circles.
from. I'm from Chicago. That has not been my experience. And I mean, most of the stuff I've seen in terms of breakdowns of guys and how they react to confrontation is roughly similar to what I'm
But
saying. In
that's
fact,
interesting. Oh, go ahead.
interestingly enough, the group that is most nervous about racial conversations is upper middle class white women. Like, in terms of people that will not express like things that they feel, like sometimes vote Republican because they're afraid that they will be attacked for them. It's very much that will I be called a Karen demographic. So I mean, I think it's not really like me pushing back in response to the pushback. It would just
Mhm.
I think that a lot of these things to me seem like human traits that probably are unevenly distributed among groups. And the idea of teaching, say, African Americans to stand up for themselves, I think is a great one. That's
Mhm.
no one has any issue with that. I mean, in the hypothetical group in my mind. But I think that this would also be found among pretty much every population. White women, I think, would be afraid to say, no, that doesn't sound racist to me at all, in many situations where something's genuinely dubious because they fear an argument. So I think that's just fairly human. But a question, how would you guys define racism when you say, this is just something I'm interested in because there are a lot of definitions in society today, as there seem to be with feminism, for example, another phrase we've talked about on the show. But when you say someone should be able to respond to something that they think racist, and we've given a couple examples, what is racism to you guys? And I have no like interjections for this one at all. I'm just curious.
Mhm, mhm. For me, racism, and I really love Kendi's like really basic definition, and there's a lot more to it. But at the basic level, it's, am I responding to somebody because of their race, and especially treating them in a way that's less than because of their race. So if I walk into a room, here's an example. I walk into a room and everyone's like, oh my gosh, wow, we're so glad you're here because you're black. And that's the only thing people want to talk to me about is the fact that I'm black. And there's nothing about like, why am I here? What do I have to contribute? It's just like, I'm here and I'm checking a box. For me, that's racist.
I've been in a
If
lot of
you
those rooms.
Yeah, yeah. And for me, if I walk into the room and people are like, hey, Charles, like you did all of these shows, we're really interested in getting to know who you are as Charles, then to me, that's not racist.
Right.
So it's really about, am I responding to somebody because of their identity, and especially in a way that either like trivializes them, puts them in a box, or denigrates them.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, one of the things that's really important when we're talking about racism is to look systemically at what's happening with the statistics in terms of who's in prison, who's getting a college education, who's being supported to get their driver's license, for God's sake. How are people being treated in medical situations? Why are Black women and their children dying at so much higher rates with childbirth than white women and children? So racism for me starts to begin to point towards the systemic level, which for me is the most important thing to talk about. I mean, microaggressions are huge because on an individual level, there's so much health impact. But on a systemic level, that's where we need to go. So we need to get people talking about it in order to get people, white people who've been white for 70 years, have a sense of what's really going on and that things need to change.
Okay, let's go to the book. Let's get some things from the book. So what? And let's go to Sarah, because Sarah just mentioned something about that. So you both start off with your kind of your background, a little intro, like about me kind of deal. And in it, Sarah, you talk about having trials and tribulations and difficulties in life and suffering trauma, and not understanding at the time that you still had white privilege, and white privilege is so important, and how you still had these societal advantages regardless of any trauma or struggles you face. So talk about why that's important.
Well, it's such a common thing, isn't it? I mean, before we start to realize that we're white, then we just have this sense of like everybody's on an equal playing field here. And we don't know those statistics. We don't know about Black women and babies dying. We don't know that there's a problem. We don't know there's a problem. We can't fix it. So the book, in some ways, a part of the book really begins to address the resistance that we might have to beginning to see that those statistics are important.
Well, I guess the two-parter for you, then I'm gonna go to your intro too, Roxy. Don't go anywhere. You're coming up.
No worries. No worries.
But so one thing is, what do you say to any Black people who might have an issue with that because they think that you're saying that you have some access that they don't have? I'll start there. I won't ask it as two parts. Just ask you, what do you say to anyone who says that?
I haven't run into that. Let's see if I imagine it. If you say to me, Sarah,
I didn't hear it.
Oh, I said I haven't run into that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I also want to say,
asking?
I also want to add that if we're talking about kind of general statistics. So if any individual, like, I don't know, what's his name? If Oprah Winfrey came up to Sarah and said like, hey, I have way more privileges than you, it'd be
But
like, yeah,
Oprah
you do.
wouldn't say that though, because Oprah actually said she has less privilege than the white guy in the trailer park.
But my point is that
say all
if a
kind of
white
stupid
person
shit. I mean,
came
the
up,
point is correct.
if a person came up and said, I have more privilege than you in X, Y, or Z, we'll be like, okay, let's talk about it, right?
Okay.
So it's
okay, so we acknowledge that there may be some people that doesn't capable cover. Okay, but then the other thing is, I get into trouble because people expect me to say that white privilege doesn't exist, and I don't believe that. I do believe white privilege exists. The problem, because it's so heavy in the culture, we hear it all the time, like it's this giant behemoth. And my problem is, just like you said, it's situational. So every white person doesn't experience. I don't think that, like you said in your example, every white person, regardless of their background and situation, would have more privilege than every Black person, right? So everyone doesn't necessarily experience it. And it's not the only type of privilege.
Yeah.
Would you agree that it's not the only type of? See, yeah, but it's the only one we talk about, right? We never, as a society, I'm not saying you or you, but I'm saying in society, when you turn on the news, we can hear white privilege. You can Google white privilege, whatever. No one talks about, there being a privilege to having two-parent household. There being a privilege to having a certain income level. There being a privilege to being born in America compared to certain other people in the world. So why is it? Obviously, you all nodded, so you agree that there are other privileges. So why is this the only one we talk about?
Well, I think first I got to say, at least in my circles, people do talk about all of those other privileges. They're super important. Intersectionality has been, it's a really huge thing people have been talking about for a long time. And then the other reason that people talk about all of these things is that when you look, like, again, intersectionality, if I look at class privilege, we also know that regardless of class, if I'm Black and I'm wealthy, I have less privilege than a white person who's wealthy. That if I am educated, and there's like privilege around education, that a Black person will have less privilege and have more problems than a white person with the same degree of education. So that's part of the reason we talk about it.
Got you. And to your intro. So in your intro, you talked about being here as an immigrant, going to Harlem, noticing some differences there, and understand and trying to, fit in, because your parents had a certain way that they were raising you, and it was a little different from those other kids, and you're trying to figure out why. And then you moved to the Upper West Side, And then those kids were, there were different demographic, I think mostly white and Asian, kind of like it is now. And it was a different demographic. So you notice some differences there. And that's where you really notice that the white supremacy. So I'm wondering what was the behaviors and conditions that you saw in Harlem that you felt were a result of racism, first of all, and then I'll ask you a question about the move to the other part.
Yeah, so as a child, I didn't understand this, but when I look back at what I experienced in Harlem, like, I lived in a house. My parents were amazing, but there was a time when our house had no heat in the middle of winter.
Right.
We had like inconsistent water. There were just so many problems. Like our grocery stores didn't have access to like, really good quality fruits and vegetables. We would go off to New Jersey to white neighborhoods. And all of that to me were examples of racism, right? So the kids who were growing up in the Upper West Side where I went to like middle school essentially,
Right.
they didn't have those problems. They lived in buildings that
But
had
how is
access.
it racism? I guess I don't understand how it's racism. I get it. It sounds
Because we're
like it's
talking about
economic problem.
it's systemic racism. For
Yeah.
me, it's really about systemic racism. It's about, when we talk about which communities are going to have access to the resources, which communities are going to get funding from the government to make sure that the rules are followed, and which communities are kind of like, we're going to let this like be under the radar. Which communities are stores going to say, we're going to, like right now where I live in California, some of our neighborhoods are saying we can't get a Whole Foods. And some places are saying, well, we can get a Whole Foods. Some of that's class.
Right. Oh no! Don't go anywhere, Roxy.
A lot
Don't
of that's
go.
class, but
Okay.
some of it is also racism, right? It's like we're not going to put a Whole Foods in. Okay, I'm still here. Yeah, we're not
Okay.
going to put a Whole Foods in like a predominantly black neighborhood, and they'll say it's because that neighborhood is poor. Well, why is that neighborhood poor? Because they haven't had access to the kind of housing wealth, they haven't had access to the same kind of jobs. Like there are a whole bunch of things, so they all intersect.
Can I make one comment here?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, fair enough. So it seems like we're talking about two really different things here when we discuss racism. And I've actually found this pretty often, and I totally agree with one of them. I think there's some real issues, whether or not you guys agree with me, on the second one of them. So the first idea is that treating people differently or in a markedly inferior fashion because of their race is racism. And I think at this point, the large majority of Americans would agree with that. The second argument really is the thing I offered to debate Kendi on, actually, but the argument that all gaps in performance between groups indicate racism. So, I mean, when people say, for example, there's a higher rate of Black arrests among, in particular, young men, that's really where you see that gap, but then there are white arrests. The immediate response is, well, if you look at Asians, Black immigrants, a number of other people, those rates are far lower than the white rate. It's not just that they're less high than the Black rate, which could indicate white adjacency or something. They're actually lower for really trackable cultural reasons. Like Asian parents have let's say, a vigorous response policy to, trouble among their children. They're more two-parent families, so on. So I guess the question really is that, and so for example, with the Whole Foods thing, I'm originally from, I think I said this, I'm from Chicago. I lived on the south side originally, moved to pre-gentrification Wicker Park on the north side, which at the time was jokingly known as Needle Park. It was where a lot of junkies who wanted to be artists lived. And in neither one of those neighborhoods was there any sort of high-end grocery store, et cetera. One was mostly white, one was mostly Black. I live in Appalachia now, and there are, again, almost no high-end grocery stores of any kind. So, I mean, in addition to class being perhaps 60% of that, there are also other bluntly obvious variables like crime. I mean, if you run a Whole Foods, even leaving race aside, you're not going to build one in Appalachia.
It's important. They just closed the one in Chicago.
Yes, they did. This really pissed me off, actually, but they closed it because during the past couple of years of rioting, which was heavy in Chicago, these were not necessarily peaceful protests all or even the majority of the time, the store lost an incredible amount of money. And then as the theft laws relaxed, it lost an incredible amount of money over and over for 2 years. These aren't exclusively Black neighborhoods, by the way, we're talking about. They're
Right.
African-American, Hispanic, and ethnic white. So I guess that this is more a comment than a question, really. But in the second case of the kind of Kendi definition of racism, it strikes me that you'd have to adjust for every other factor that's in play before you could call those gaps racism. I mean, if you're looking at grocery store locations, you'd have to first deal with class, then deal with crime rate. And to me, the serious argument would be, is some percentage of the difference in crime due to past racism? Like in Appalachia, we have an incredibly high crime rate, but it's different crimes, opiate use, sales, and death, and so on. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's basically the comment. The first definition of racism seems obvious. The second definition of racism seems very debatable, and it seems like people don't often debate it, like unpacking all the variables. They either say, well, no, that's bullshit, excuse me, on the right, or they say on the left, well, obviously the only two options here are racism and genetic inferiority. And it strikes me that other things, like the average Hispanic man is 20 years younger than the average white man, have to play into things like crime rates and so on down the line.
Yes.
That was a lot, right, Roxy? Will does that sometimes.
It's a yes and.
I'm a talker.
It's a yes and. Because I think part of what I actually hear you alluding to is that these are not simple analyses. Like we can't just say this is only racism. And I don't think anybody who's really credible is saying it's only racism.
But they're not saying it. But I'm a solutions guy. I say put all the problems on the whiteboard and try to pick it out. So a lot of them stop at racism. So no, they will say in a conversation, no, it's not the only thing. But the only thing they're trying to fix is the racism. They're not trying to fix the income. They're not trying to fix the crime. They're not trying to fix anything, because even if you try to fix the other things, it goes back to race. Well, let's fix the crime then. Okay, race. Right. So they're so hung up on
the crime
race,
is due to the police misreporting. I mean, this really, it's as silly on the extremes of the right, but this goes on pretty often.
Right.
But I think part of what you're pointing to is if I try to only throw money at a problem, that's great. It's like I can help to fix some of the issues that are happening. But if racism is still part of the issue, it's not going to solve the problem alone. So it's not about, is there only one answer? Is racism the only answer? Is it the only solution? But how can we add in and have this multifaceted approach to attend to these problems?
Well, I had to cut you off. It's not to cut you off. It's because I know you're gonna have to leave soon. I got to get to a couple of these things. So you write in the book a piece where it says 417 years since the country's founded, it was implemented for, created for these white landowners specifically, which is true. And it says we're still not equal to white men. Do you two really believe that we're still not equal to white men?
When you say it this way, it's a really interesting sound. So let me say it differently. I 100% believe that global majority of people. Let me finish. Okay. I 100% believe that global majority of people are the equal of any white person.
I didn't get to the global majority. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And I also believe that we still don't have a society that treats global majority people equal to white men. So yeah.
That was a tricky answer. So we are equal.
I actually think it's a pretty fair answer. So I mean, this is one of the more coherent responses from someone on kind of the political center left I've heard. Like, of course, racism, especially historical, is one of the variables that contributes to these gaps. It's not the only one. I would also argue but it's not the most significant one. I mean, I think if you were to look through Appalachian trailer parks or something like that, you would find the same pathologies at almost exactly the same rates, because humans are genetically equal, that you would find in the hood. So the question really is how to stop that.
Yeah, that's the
i.e. so like, and I think, Charles, this is my read of your point. You're saying if we focus a lot of money on getting rid of racism, and we provide an anti-racist training that really works, and it sounds like you guys have a pretty solid one. So racism is eliminated from the situation on the south side of Chicago. What does that fix? Like, is that right? Like, what percent of the problem in the hood is actually gone when you get rid of
the inverse of what she said. She said if you fix all the other problems and the racism still there, the problem doesn't go away. True. And I'm saying if you fix the racism and don't fix the other problem, then the problems don't go away. Also true. So I get that we're saying we're fixing both, but that's human condition. That's harder to fix. So the only place we disagree is what percentage of each. You probably think racism is a higher percentage of the problem than I do. And I think I can fix what I can control. I can't fix human nature. That takes a severe level of hubris to think you're going to stop humans from being humans, right? So I think that's a much longer fix than teaching a guy how to weld, right? Or teaching somebody how to be a chef.
So are you saying, can I just check? Because part of what I'm hearing, the implication of what you're saying is that you think it's human nature to be racist.
I think it's human nature to put people in boxes. So you might call it a different label. It may not be. So I may not judge you because you're race, but I'm sexist. I may not be a sexist, but I'm against your religion. I may be an ageist. So the ist might be different, but it's human nature to do bad and to be kind of like self-motivated, to be greedy, that's human nature. Yes, you're not going to weed out. Okay, if everybody was white, there would still be murder. Am I wrong? If there were no global majority people, only white people in the world, would there still be murder?
We can just look at historical Europe. I mean, but
Yes.
Yeah.
So
defer
why
to
are
the
they
guest on
murdering?
that one.
So why are they murdering? Why are they
But
stealing? Why are they?
there's
Why
a
are they
difference
taking money?
between is there going to be murder and is there going to be systematic
Yes,
oppression
there's
and
going to
murder of
be
a certain group?
systemic. There's going to be in
I don't
China.
necessarily agree.
In China, they have groups that are systematically oppressed. Not the Uyghurs. You walk into China, they look exactly like everyone else, right? When there was a war in Japan, Japanese people fled and they went to Brazil. They are genetically Japanese people. Now they try to go back. They have full citizenship. There's places that put up rent signs that we won't rent to you. You and I walk in there, we can't tell them apart. Just a bunch of Japanese people, but they won't rent to them. It's human nature. Right. So I think I think we're trying to fix something that, okay, even if you can fix it, which I don't believe you can, I don't think I think it's easy to teach a guy to be a chef. It's easier to teach a guy to drive a truck. It's easier to teach a guy to fly. It's easier to teach a
But
guy
I've
to
also found
read for 2 hours.
it's easy to teach people to start, it's easy to teach people to like let go of some of these beliefs.
That's
Like we have gone from even from when I've been in the US and even like if we go back like 50 years, it's already markedly different.
yeah, but I
So
think the
I don't
racism's
buy
getting
this
worse.
idea that we can't teach people to be different.
Yeah, but I think racism's getting worse. You don't think racism's getting worse? I think it's getting worse.
I know like my friend, her parents had to leave this country and go to Puerto Rico because they were in an interracial relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have a lot of people who think that that's fine, right? So
Oh yeah,
I think
that's
things,
different, but it's getting it's getting different, it's getting worse in different ways, right? So
Well,
yes, the legal protections are there, but like that's why you
no,
have a
but the
grown.
opinions are changing also.
there also, I think, are different definitions of racism here. So, I mean, like Charles, when you say racism is getting worse, what most people seem to say today is that the backlash to traditional racism, like some of the things BLM or the pro-Palestine movement, got so annoying for many people that they became very slightly more prejudiced. And I think that's true, actually. But if you look at like traditional, conventional racism against
Oh
like a
yeah,
1950s baseline,
oh that
it,
was
it
fixed in
would be
2000. They should have
hard
just
to
let it
argue
go.
that that's so they're actually, the thing that people are saying is getting worse is perception of race relations. So there's an interesting dichotomy there. And this so first of all, by the way, productive conversation. I mean, the difference here seems to be what percentage of social gaps different people think are due to different things. Is it racism, classism, sexism, or something totally unrelated, like dads aren't there and kids don't have job skills? So that's interesting.
Right.
But in terms of modern attitudes toward race, like since the 1990s, at least my read, is that the percentage of people who said race relations are good has dropped from like 70 to 30. It's a
Right.
crazy drop. But the actual percentage of people in interracial marriages and so on is up massively. That's 27% of all marriages.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this weird situation where race relations are good, but people don't know it. And actually, I do think that
Or
ties into the one critique of the anti-racist movement, which is, are we focusing on race too much?
Well, I would say it's a little bit different because when you basically the challenge that I'm hearing in your analysis is something about that difference between negative peace and positive peace. So if I don't talk about it and we're just like pretending that everything is okay and all of these people are being quiet about these inequities, then I can say that racism is great. Like there's not a big problem. I think people are talking about it a lot more, not because it's getting worse, but because we're actually willing to talk about it. And that's a good thing. It's like we have to be able to talk about it and to take steps to fix it, because then it truly gets better. It's not just whitewashed with all of the pun intended to make
So
things better.
that's an interesting line. I actually want to shout out, although I'm not sure I agree with it. You think we're talking about race more as race relations are getting better, and partly because they're getting better.
Right. Go on,
Okay.
Sarah. You're muted, Sarah.
You're on mute, Sarah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the penalties for speaking out were so extraordinarily horrific. I mean, the statistics for lynching, for example, were so much higher for Black men. I mean, it's still really iffy for a Black man to express any kind of anger in a public space. There's a real need for an expansive vision, and we're moving more toward it. We're more able to talk about Black women and babies dying more. We're more able to talk about how if Black women have Black physicians, fewer babies die, fewer moms die during the childbirth process. Mm-hmm. These are important conversations to have, and they were not conversations that anybody was having when I was in my teens. I'm 60, so 50 years ago, 40 years ago.
Can I ask one last question about the book? You talked about trauma, and I think the line was, trauma has no sense of time. And I totally agree with that. And I want to make sure Will's not drinking because I don't want him to have a spit take. Because trauma has no sense of time. But what I find is weird in the climate today is people are discussing trauma that they never experienced.
I'm sorry, can you say more?
The trauma of slavery, I hear a lot. So don't you have to kind of experience this trauma or be next to someone who experienced it to have a traumatic slavery experience?
Well, I don't exactly know what you're referring to, but
I'm referring to people who I'm referring to people who say that the behaviors like the behaviors Roxy was talking about, she noticed in Harlem, like she talked about systemic racism. That's a different thing. I'm talking about the people who link it to the legacy of slavery.
Okay. So one of the things to take into account is that there's clear research that shows epigenetic effects of historical trauma on present day folks. We see it in Holocaust survivors. We see it in
Holocaust survivors. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Survivors are those papers. Not at all to interrupt, but I have some questions about like post-traumatic slavery syndrome or like later post-traumatic Judaism and all that sort of stuff.
But go on. I'm sorry. You said we see it in Holocaust survivors. Go on.
We see it in the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, that there's epigenetic changes that make their bodies more reactive to stress. So we know that historical trauma has an impact. The beautiful work of Moshe Gif, who's an epigeneticist at the University in Toronto, he found that when there was the Quebec ice storm in the early 90s, that he could see the Quebec ice storm written in the epigenetic sheath, in the protein sheath around the DNA of the folks who lived through it. And then their children also, and had markers that were visible and shared in the whole community for this experience. So we know that there's not such a huge difference. It's not some kind of magical thinking that people are referring to. People are actually referring to hard science, where they're seeing changes in stress responses based on what our grandparents and great-grandparents lived through. So I just want to get that out there.
Can I make one comment on that?
Mm-hmm.
That's actually a good summary of the little bit of the research I've read. But my understanding is if your ancestors down to 2 or 3 generations maybe personally experience very intense stress, there are changes in the level of stress hormones that are released during pregnancy and so on. But in terms of the issues that we have in society, like high levels of mental illness among Caucasians or currently high levels of crime among African Americans, I'm not sure how correlated that is. I mean, Jews, for example, are probably the most successful group in American society, if we're talking about ethnic whites or African Americans. And that trauma would be about 2 generations back. We forget how recently that was. So, I mean, the argument that all African Americans or Irishmen or something like that have these trackable effects, I actually haven't really seen a lot of evidence of that. Like, you would assume that the people that are most affected in society today would be what, Eastern Europeans or West Africans, maybe. So, I mean, again, I'd want to look at that, although it's a very interesting idea.
And I guess my concern was, I don't think that the people that you're talking about have been studied. So you're using comparative studies of other groups of people, but the studies aren't of the people that have the lineage of slavery. So you're using the examples of a study of other groups of people and say, because that is possible, that's probably likely what's happening here.
Roxy, do you know any epigenetic studies for African Americans? I am not.
I don't. And it's
Yeah.
almost like, for me, this isn't an argument that I focus on. So I would say it's almost like, I would say it's outside of my scope. So
Got you.
like really great things for your listeners to research more
Right,
and
I guess so.
something for me to look at. But yeah, I wouldn't feel
All right.
competent to comment.
All right. Well, are there any final statements or last things you want people to take away, make them want to get the book and to understand about the Antiracist Heart? Each of you.
I think,
Mhm.
yeah, I think probably what I would want to say to folks listening to this is, this has been a really fun conversation, but if a listener is saying, sometimes I do have a problem knowing how to respond, how to speak up, how to speak my truth or to intervene when I see something happening, get the books. We're going to help you learn how to do that.
Sarah?
Yeah. And for listeners who are thinking, oh, Roxy's and Sarah's information sounds a little bit different than what I've heard before. It's just a real freeing way to move into difficult conversations.
Right. Well, it's definitely a different approach, and I would say whether you agree with it or not, unlike a lot of what I heard, you all do not cancel people or take them off and dehumanize them because they disagree. So I think that is important. They are Dr. Roxy, Roxanne Manning, and Sarah Peyton, authors of the Antiracist Heart, if I can get to this, a Self-Compassion and Activism Handbook. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
I got a country to say, God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving a day.